Hello and welcome to this pre-recorded event for GCE Government and Politics. Feedback on June 2015, Units 3 and 4, Route A. To help you get the most out of this feedback, you may want to have the following documents handy, as we will refer to them during the session. The specification, which lays out the key requirements for each examination topic. The Getting Started document, which expands on the specification and highlights the sort of material likely to be covered in the questions asked. The mark schemes for both papers, which lay out the main points credited on each question and the thresholds for Level 2 and Level 3 responses. The lead examiner's reports, which summarise issues with the papers as a whole, and with individual questions in particular, and explain the key differences between stronger and weaker candidates and their responses. In this event, delegates will have the opportunity to receive feedback on national performance of candidates in Units 3 and 4 Route A of the June 2015 examination series. Consider the variation of candidates' performance on different questions and possible reasons why. Look at the examiner's report. Address common issues. The first item is an example of a clear Level 3 response from Question 1 on the 3A paper. What domestic factors have limited the government's ability to stimulate growth since 2010? It was obviously essential here for students to understand the significance of the concept economic growth in order to deliver a good answer. The candidate discusses three distinct points covering the limitations of growth arising from government debt, lack of confidence, and unemployment. In each case, there is a clear link made between the problem and the subsequent limitations on growth, and the candidate makes effective use of evidential statistics to demonstrate their understanding. With a little more development or a more explicit explanation of economic growth, this response might have achieved full marks, but in the event was awarded 13. This next item is an example of a much weaker response to the same question. The response is limited in how closely it addresses the question of the limitations on stimulating growth, which is not clearly defined. The explanation of Brown's policies up until 2010 might have been used to make a link to post-2010 issues. But it is not explained in this manner and therefore gleans little credit. The remaining points, on the criticisms of austerity and the Northern Powerhouse, both have potential relevance, but are very undeveloped. The candidate does ultimately sneak into Level 2 with 6 marks because there are 3 potentially decent points, which, had they been properly developed and linked to the question, might have secured a reasonable mark. If we look at the characteristics of strong candidates on Question 1, we can see clear lessons for all of the 3A short response questions. These are a tight focus on the question and on the key command words within it, whether they be domestic on this question, for and against on Question 2, consensus on Question 3, and so on. Argument and evidence owe their assertion. That is to say, not simply making a point and then moving on, but instead explaining why it supports the argument that the candidate is advancing, and then bringing in supporting evidence. In a similar vein, clearly explaining the links from a cause to an effect, rather than simply identifying both and asserting that there is a causal connection. Maintaining a good balance between breadth and depth. 3 well-developed points will generally prove more successful on a short response than half a dozen brief points, or a single point no matter how well developed and evidenced. We will now have a look at a 3A essay question. In this case, question 6. How effective have governments since 1997 been in tackling environmental challenges? Aside from the obvious need to focus on environmental challenges, the key requirements here were to consider more than one government since 1997 and to focus on effectiveness. This candidate clearly meets the level 3 thresholds as a good response. They consider a range of relevant policy in detail, and although they get a little sidetracked in places, for example, with the details on hybrids, there is focus throughout on effectiveness with good use of supporting statistics. They also show good balance in terms of the degree of effectiveness seen under more than one government. They conclude with some clear relevant synopticity about party views. A wider range of policy would have taken this even higher, but as it is, it scored 10 out of 12 for AO1 knowledge and understanding, 9 out of 12 for AO2 analysis, 9 out of 12 for synopticity, and 7 out of 12 for AO3 communication, giving a total of 35 out of 45. This is a weaker response to the same question, although it is basic rather than poor and is placed in level 2. It does consider a good deal of relevant policy, but falls down in terms of assessing its effectiveness rather than simply labelling some policies good or bad. There are also some marginal points in terms of tackling environmental challenges, for example, on fox hunting. It is hard to see much synopticity here. There is some use of being criticised or controversial, but it would have been useful for the candidate to identify where these views came from. The candidate scored 7 out of 12 for AO1 knowledge and understanding, which was their strongest element, 6 out of 12 for AO2 analysis, 5 out of 12 for synopticity, and 5 out of 9 for AO3 communication, giving a total of 23 out of 45. Again, we can draw clear parallels between strong candidates on question 6 and on the other 3A essay response questions. The key characteristics are a tight focus on all aspects of the question, in this case, governments, and effective. For question 7, it was rehabilitation revolution, and for question 8, transform. A clear understanding of all relevant political terminology, and in particular, any relevant key concepts from the specification. Balance, both between different sides of the debate and, where relevant to the question, different governments. This balance need not be exactly equal, but on both Unit 3A and Unit 4A, there are never any one-sided essay questions asked. Strong awareness of relevant policy with, critically, a link between it and the specific question. A range of relevant synoptic material where views are not simply stated or given to some, but are ascribed to those who hold them, whether individuals, groups, or parties. This is an optional activity which I will summarize, and then you may want to pause the video at that point to carry out the activity. Look at the example question 4 response above. Using the mark scheme, decide firstly what level you think should be awarded and why. Then what mark you think should be awarded and why. Please now pause the presentation if you wish to carry out the activity. This candidate was placed in mid-level 3 and awarded 13 marks. They meet the Level 3 entry requirements shown in the mark scheme thresholds, which are firstly a clear understanding of the nature of economic globalization, and secondly, a clear understanding of the implications of globalization for economic policymaking in the UK. The understanding of economic globalization is explicitly, if briefly, introduced at the start, and then reinforced through the subsequent points. Each of those points on global prices, transnational corporations, and regulation is pertinent and clearly explained. These points are also linked to accurate examples, for example, the recent reduction in oil prices. This is overall a very focused answer, which is in large part why it achieves a high mark, although a little development could have taken it to full marks. For example, the candidate might have explained the ways in which the tax gap might affect economic policymaking in other areas. I should emphasize here that economic globalization and a key concept contained within the specification should be very familiar to candidates, and none should miss its significance. There are again wider points we can take from this question to understand the characteristics of successful candidates in general. Firstly, a clear understanding of the key concepts, particularly those contained in a specification. Secondly, the accuracy of the links made from issue to impact, and how well those links are argued and evidenced. Thirdly, the use of pertinent examples to illustrate points made. In contrast, both here and on other questions, less successful candidates often missed the significance of key concepts in the question, focused overmuch on one particular argument, were too brief, woolly, or overly assertive in the links between issue and impact, suffered from timing problems, resulting in short, rushed answers. It is worth noting that half the marks on the paper come from the short responses, and that a candidate's time should be divided roughly equally between them. Some candidates find the expression "a minute a mark" to be helpful in recalling the approximate timings. We will now move on to look at the 4A paper, again beginning with the short response questions. This first item is a mid-level 2 response from question 2 on the 4A paper. Assess the main criticisms of the Common Agricultural Policy. Many candidates struggled with the first word of the question and offered no assessment. But this does not apply to the two examples that we will look at here. This first candidate does put in some assessment, albeit brief and before rather than after each criticism is considered. However, the points are underdeveloped. There is little explanation of why the CAP costs so much, why it sends the money to the wrong places, or how it leads to food surpluses. Properly developing these points and then offering clear assessment of them could have taken this candidate into clear level 3 rather than mid-level 2. This is a stronger example of a question 2 response, although the gap is not enormous. There are actually only 2 criticisms considered here rather than 3, so it is important to understand why this candidate gains a higher mark than the previous candidate. Firstly, the clear definition, although not essential, is helpful and creditable. Secondly, the 2 criticisms are clearly better developed than in the previous response, which compensates for the narrower range. Third, the assessment is fuller. It is not perfect because it is not specifically geared against each specific criticism made. Nevertheless, it is sufficiently clear and accurate to carry this just into level 3, and this candidate scored 11 marks. As with the 3A paper, the characteristics of weaker candidates on each question provide some useful lessons for all short response questions. In this case, The importance of noting all the key words in the question, whether they be to assess in question 2, to focus on criticisms in question 3, or to explain why in question 5. To keep material up to date, considering the impact of more recent treaties and reforms. To analyse rather than to simply describe, to consider why, not just what. To argue points through and not to simply assert them briefly before moving on to the next points. Moving on to the 4A essay section, we will now consider two contrasting responses to question 7. The Council of Ministers remains the most influential body in the European Union. Discuss. Where there is an essay question on EU institutions, some candidates will tend to trot out a rehearsed answer, either covering every institution in turn without explicitly linking back to the one asked about, or alternatively focusing on the one institution they want to discuss, regardless of whether it is the one identified in the question. In this case, this candidate would clearly have preferred a question about the European Parliament, which starts them off on a poor footing. They then go on to show serious confusion between the Council, Parliament and Commission, which, in an institutions question, is always going to be a major limiting factor. The candidate also shows limited reference throughout to key concepts from this topic, such as accountability and the democratic deficit in certain institutions. Ultimately, the response is short and imperfectly formed. The candidate escapes L1 only on communication, since the structure and phraseology are quite clear, albeit with limited content. The final mark was 4 out of 12 each for AO1 knowledge and understanding, AO2 analysis and synopticity, and 4 out of 9 for AO3 communication, for a total of 16 out of 45. The next response creates a clear contrast to the previous candidate in terms of approach. There is useful context at the start which, whilst not essential, aids clarity. They then lay out several points about the influence of the Council before going on to consider both the Commission and Parliament, but, critically, linking them both back to the Council rather than considering them in isolation. They interpret co-reper in a particular way, as being part of the Council and yet not exactly part of the Council. Other candidates, and indeed the EU itself, may place a different spin on it, but this is, nevertheless, a reasonable and creditable interpretation. A slight limitation to this candidate's marks is on synopticity. There are lots of alternative views, but they are mostly not specifically ascribed to who holds them. For example, which countries or political parties or office holders have advanced those views, which keeps that mark in level 2. The final mark was 10 out of 12 each for AO1 knowledge and understanding and AO2 analysis, 8 out of 12 for synopticity, and 6 out of 9 for AO3 communication, for a total of 34 out of 45. If we again pull out the lessons from this particular question, we see that the keys to success in 4A essay questions are to get the understanding of key institutions as well as key concepts and treaties correct, address the specific question asked, and to tie any related information back to the question, analyse rigorously, including through direct contrast between competing institutions or theories. Support this with detailed and accurate evidence. This is the second optional activity which I will summarise, and then you may want to pause at that point to carry out the activity. Look at the example question 4 response above. Using the mark scheme, decide firstly what level you think should be awarded and why. Then, what mark you think should be awarded and why. Please now pause the presentation if you wish to carry out the activity. the candidate was placed in the higher end of Level 2 and awarded 9 marks. They meet the first Level 3 entry requirements shown in the mark scheme thresholds for their understanding of the role. However, the question asks how significant, which requires balance, and this is a one-sided answer. This means that the candidate fails to meet the second criteria of a clear understanding of the arguments for and against their significance. They also lack specific reference to post holders and events which, although not in the thresholds and therefore not essential for Level 3, would have been most useful. Nevertheless, this response must clearly be at the higher end of Level 2, as it is rather better than limited in terms of understanding the ways in which the post is significant. All 3 arguments here are reasonable, which is why it goes as high as 9 marks. To reach Level 3, the candidate needed to discuss at least one clear argument that the post is not significant. Preferably, they should also have linked at least one of their points to a contemporary event and the impact that the post holder at the time had on that event. So, for the final time, we can now look at the wider conclusions to be drawn from the performance of successful candidates on this question. Firstly, balance where balance is required. Secondly, a link between the points made and the supporting examples, preferably tied into the relevant post holders and events, or indeed the relevant treaties and controversies. Third, a clear and accurate understanding of the post, institution or concept under consideration, shown either explicitly and separately if specifically required by the question, or otherwise shown through the points made. In contrast, less successful candidates focus too much on what rather than the significance, or similarly, on question 5 about Labour's approach to the EU, too much on what rather than why. Fail to advance appropriate or accurate examples. Are one-sided on a question that demands balance, or indeed two-sided on a question that does not demand balance. So, we can now draw out the common issues across the 2 papers, which are discussed in more detail in the 2 reports from the lead examiner. Firstly, it is critical that candidates read the question carefully, preferably at least twice, and answer everything in it, but also only what is in it. That includes command words, demands for balance, and the particular focus required. Secondly, the contemporary focus is very important to success at Route A. Whilst questions closely follow the specification and the Getting Started document, there will always be opportunities for stronger candidates to demonstrate their knowledge of relevant up-to-date material through their answers. The key is to seek out those opportunities, whilst ensuring that it is clearly linked to effective debate and not simply descriptive or irrelevant. Thirdly, the accurate understanding of the specific institutions or concepts, particularly on Unit 4, is vital. Equally, and particularly on Question 3, any and all statistical evidence cited must be robust and accurate. Penultimately, there is little credit available on either paper for assertion or general points, but much more for specific and developed arguments, particularly where they are backed up with evidence and examples. Finally, for the synopticity marks on essay questions, the least successful responses give little or no attention to competing political viewpoints. Slightly more successful responses consider competing viewpoints, but do not discuss who holds them. The best responses identify the groups, individuals, parties, or countries who hold those competing viewpoints and why. That concludes the specific commentary on these papers, but if you would like to know more about examination statistics, then you may find these links of interest to you. They show the number of candidates achieving each grade and the marks required to do so. As you all know, GCEs and A-levels are changing. But as you may be aware, government and politics is not in the first round of changes. The new specification will be introduced from 2017, which means that the first AS level examinations will take place in 2018 and the first A-level examinations in 2019. Specifications will be published on the Edexcel website in draft form to enable teachers to have early sight of our proposed approach. We are also running a series of launch events too. Our draft specs and SAMs, as well as further information about our launch events, will be on edexcel.com. Thank you for listening. We constantly look to improve the delivery of our training and appreciate all delegate feedback. You will soon receive an email directing you to our online feedback form. The form takes no more than a couple of minutes to complete. Please take the time to let us know your thoughts by filling in this short form.